I got something super cool for you today on TonDoesLinux Podcast. You know, I've been getting a lot of questions lately about different Linux distributions and which ones people should actually use.
Oh man, this is exactly what I've been wanting to talk about. I mean, there's just so much to cover when it comes to different distros, and I've literally tried almost all of them.
That's actually perfect because I was hoping we could break down some of the most popular ones today. You know, like Ubuntu, Fedora, Arch, that whole scene.
Absolutely. The thing is, well, each one of these distributions has its own, special characteristics that make them really unique. And I'm totally excited to dive deep into what makes each one tick.
Perfect. I've got a ton of questions about this, so let's start breaking these down. So let's kick things off with Ubuntu, which is probably the one most people have heard of, right? What makes it so special compared to other distributions?
Oh man, Ubuntu is it's basically become the go-to Linux distribution for so many people, and there's a really good reason for that. First off, it's just incredibly user-friendly. Like when you're coming from Windows or Mac, Ubuntu feels familiar, you know what I mean?
What exactly makes it feel more familiar?
The interface is just super intuitive. They've got this desktop environment called GNOME that's really polished and clean. And the whole system is basically designed to work right out of the box. You don't have to mess with drivers or configuration files most of the time.
And I'm guessing that makes it perfect for people just starting out with Linux?
Exactly. But here's the thing. It's not just for beginners. I mean, I've been using Linux for years, and I still find myself coming back to Ubuntu for certain projects. The community support is it's absolutely massive. Like, if you run into any problem, someone's probably already solved it and posted the solution online.
You mentioned using it for certain projects. What kind of stuff do you usually use Ubuntu for?
So personally, I use it a lot for web development work. The package management system is really stable, and you've got access to basically every development tool you could need. Plus, most software vendors, when they release Linux versions of their apps, they usually target Ubuntu first.
That's actually pretty interesting. How about for regular, everyday use?
It's perfect for that. Like, you can do everything from browsing the web, watching videos, doing office work, and the Software Center makes installing new apps super straightforward. Plus, the long-term support versions, they're supported for 5 whole years, which means you don't have to worry about major system changes for a really long time.
5 years? That's quite a commitment from them.
Absolutely. And that's part of what makes Ubuntu such a reliable choice for both personal and professional use. The company behind it, Canonical, they're really committed to making Linux accessible to everyone. And they've basically created this whole ecosystem around Ubuntu with different flavors for different needs.
So, let's talk about Fedora. I've heard it's got some connection to Red Hat. What's that all about?
Oh yeah, Fedora is it's basically the testing ground for Red Hat Enterprise Linux, and that's what makes it really special. See, Red Hat is this massive company that provides enterprise Linux solutions, and Fedora is where they try out all their cutting-edge features first.
What kind of features are we talking about here?
So Fedora is always right there at the bleeding edge. They're usually one of the first distributions to get the newest kernel updates, the latest desktop environments, and all these cool new technologies. Like right now they're doing amazing things with containerization and cloud-native tools.
That sounds pretty different from Ubuntu's approach.
Exactly. While Ubuntu focuses on stability and long-term support, Fedora is all about innovation and pushing things forward. But here's the thing. It's still incredibly polished. Like, they've managed to make bleeding edge actually usable. You know what I mean?
Who would you say is the target audience for Fedora then?
So Fedora is perfect for developers and tech enthusiasts who want the latest features but don't want to deal with something as intense as Arch. And it's becoming really popular in workplaces especially in companies that use Red Hat Enterprise Linux, because the skills just transfer over perfectly.
How does the workplace adoption compare to Ubuntu?
That's interesting because while Ubuntu probably has more overall adoption, Fedora has this really strong presence in tech companies and development shops. Like if you're working with Red Hat technologies, Fedora just makes sense because it's like getting a preview of what's coming to Red Hat Enterprise Linux.
What about the learning curve? Is it harder to use than Ubuntu?
I'd say it's slightly more demanding than Ubuntu, but not by much. The main thing is that you need to be comfortable with things changing more frequently. Like Fedora releases new versions every 6 months, and they're pretty aggressive about adopting new technologies. But the documentation is excellent, and the community is super helpful and knowledgeable.
So we've covered Ubuntu and Fedora, but I've been really curious about Arch Linux. I keep hearing about it being like super different.
Oh man, Arch is it's absolutely fascinating, and it's completely different from what we've been talking about. Like it follows this philosophy of what they call the Arch way, which is all about simplicity and user-centric design.
What makes it so unique compared to the others?
So the biggest thing is that Arch uses a rolling release model, which means you're constantly getting updates. There's no version numbers, no big releases. You're just always running the latest everything. And the really cool part is that you build your system from the ground up.
Wait, from the ground up? What do you mean by that?
Like when you install Arch, you start with basically nothing, just a command line, and you have to choose every single component you want to install. It's like building with Lego blocks, right? You decide exactly what goes into your system.
That sounds pretty intimidating. Is it as hard as it sounds?
Well, I won't sugarcoat it. The installation process is definitely challenging, especially for newcomers. But here's the thing. Arch has probably the best documentation in the Linux world. The Arch wiki is just incredible. Like, even people who don't use Arch refer to it.
What kind of customization options are we talking about here?
Oh man, literally everything. You choose your bootloader, your display server, your desktop environment, or maybe you don't want a desktop environment at all. And the package manager, Pacman, is just blazing fast. Plus, you have access to the AUR, which is this huge repository of user-maintained packages.
So who would actually benefit from using something like this?
Arch is perfect for people who really want to understand how Linux works under the hood. Like, if you're the type of person who enjoys learning and wants complete control over your system. It's also great for creating really lightweight installations, because you only install what you need.
What about stability? Is it reliable enough for daily use?
That's actually a common misconception. While it's true that you're always running the latest versions, Arch is surprisingly stable if you're careful. The key is just reading the news feed before updating and making sure you understand what you're doing. I've been running it on my main machine for years now.
So, looking at all these distributions we've talked about today, I'm kind of wondering, how do you decide which one to actually go with?
You know what? That's actually a really important question, because each one of these distributions, they really shine in different scenarios. Like, let me break it down for you.
That'd be super helpful, especially for our listeners who might be thinking about making the switch.
So, Ubuntu is it's perfect for people who are just starting out with Linux, right? And it's also great for anyone who wants their computer to just work. Like, if you're coming from Windows or Mac, Ubuntu gives you this really familiar feeling.
What about for more experienced users? Is it still worth considering?
Oh, absolutely. Ubuntu is actually really versatile. It's particularly good for creative work because of all the software support. And businesses love it because of the long-term support versions. Plus, if something goes wrong, you've got this massive community to help you out.
And Fedora? Where does that fit in?
Fedora is it's perfect for developers and tech professionals. Like, if you're working with Red Hat systems at work, or if you want to stay on the cutting edge without things breaking too much. it's got this really nice balance between new features and stability.
What about comparing the learning curves between these three?
So it's kind of like a ladder, right? Ubuntu is your ground floor, super accessible. Fedora is it's a few steps up, requires a bit more Linux knowledge. And Arch is definitely at the top of that ladder. But here's the thing. You get such a deeper understanding of Linux with Arch.
Let's talk about specific use cases, like if someone's planning to use Linux for their main work computer.
For a main work machine, I'd say Ubuntu or Fedora are your best bets. Ubuntu if you need that rock-solid stability and wide software support. Fedora if you're doing development work or if you want newer features without going full Arch. And Arch is amazing if you're willing to put in the time to learn and maintain it.
What about resource usage? Do they handle differently on older hardware?
That's where it gets really interesting because with Arch, you can make it super lightweight since you're only installing what you need. Ubuntu's a bit heavier out of the box, but they've got lighter versions like Ubuntu. And Fedora sits somewhere in the middle, but it's still pretty efficient with its resources.
Before we wrap up, I'm really curious about where you see these distributions heading in the future. Like, what's next for them?
Oh man, that's such an exciting topic because there's so much happening right now. Like, Ubuntu is really pushing forward with this whole Snap package system, and they're making these really interesting moves in the cloud space.
And what about Fedora? Any exciting developments there?
Fedora is it's absolutely killing it with containerization and cloud-native development. They're really leading the charge with things like Silverblue, which is this immutable desktop concept. And they're making huge strides in security features.
That's really interesting. And Arch?
Arch is just going to keep doing what it does best, like staying cutting edge and maintaining that incredible wiki. But I think we're going to see even more automated tools built around it, like what they've done with the Arch install script.
So for our listeners who've stayed with us through this whole Linux journey, what's your final takeaway?
The most important thing is just try them out, right? Like, start with Ubuntu if you're new to Linux. It's such a solid foundation. And then maybe explore Fedora if you want to level up. Arch is there when you're ready for that deep dive into Linux.
Well, that brings us to the end of another episode of TonDoesLinux Podcast. Thanks for joining us today, everyone.
Yeah, and remember, the Linux world is it's constantly evolving, so keep exploring and learning. Thanks for listening, everyone.